Hello everyone and welcome back to Killershrewfan's 12 Days of Reviews. Every year I try to film a review that looks at least two related figures within the same video. It started with the Carnegie Fighting Dilophosaurus figures, then I did the 3 versions of the Batat Tyrannosaurus Rex, and last year I did the 4 Dino Rivals Rorivores. Those were dark times. But anyway, this year Rebor presented me with the perfect subject for this year's 2-for-1 review. After years of waiting, the grab-and-go Tyrannosaurus Rex figures have finally arrived, and we're going to be taking a look at the first 2 to hit stores today. There you can see them peeking through their plastic wrapping, ready to be released, and since there's no fancy packaging to go over with this line, I say, why wait? Let's do everyone's favorite part and unbag these 2 beauties. It's always so exciting to unbag a new dinosaur toy, and these actually came in at the same time as PNSO's Essien and another figure that I'll be reviewing here, and it took all of my self-control to wait until I was filming the reviews to open up the figures in question, so I'm very excited to be doing this now. First up, we've got the Redhead Rex, who I think I'm going to call Rawhead Rex. Fitting, don't you think? Anyway, you can see that Rawhead here comes with a tag that bears the Rebor Grab and Go logo. This is the 3rd offering from the line, the first being the Komodo Dragon and the second being the Brown Rex. You can see that Rawhead here is the B option between the 2. Next up, let's go ahead and open up the A version. And there she is, bearing a striking resemblance to the Jurassic Park Tyrannosaurus Rex in color. So I think I'm going to name this one Roberta. Hopefully naming them helps eliminate some confusion that may come during this review, otherwise I'll just look insane. Anyway, Roberta has another identical tag, save for the Type A indicator. I imagine that will make the next 2 color schemes C and D. Look at me knowing the alphabet. Everything I ever needed to know I learned in kindergarten. Anyway, since these figures are not boxed, they both come with a plastic tray to prevent their legs from warping during transit. And taped to those trays are the clear plastic stands these figures come with in the event that they need a little extra support. And I'm thinking that's definitely going to come in handy for mine, or at least Rawhead by the look of things. I gotta say, I'm impressed that Rebor included stands. I would have thought their pride would have made them certain that these things would stand no problem, but it's a nice inclusion for an already low price. Assembling the stands is a simple matter of pushing the rod into the base and then into the little cup there. And then you won't have any concerns whatsoever about your grab-and-go Rexes being able to stand. And there is a nice 360-degree look at the 2 grab-and-go Tyrannosaurus Rex figures from Rebor, and you can see that they're pushing the boundaries of what my review space can hold. They're that large. I gotta say, it's great to finally see these figures in hand. As a little background, these were first announced over 2 years ago to celebrate Rebor being in business for 4 years. They are now the 2nd item available in the grab-and-go line, which focuses on creating accurate, super affordable, but still highly detailed figures. After the success of the Komodo Dragon, fans were eagerly awaiting these next 2 offerings, but the goalpost kept moving, partly due to Rebor's spasmodic nature, and then due to 2020 complications, I would imagine. So it's just nice to revel in these 2 for a moment. It might have actually wound up taking too long, but that's besides the point. But now that people are finally starting to get these figures, how did they turn out? And are they as accurate as Rebor claims them to be? No, they're not. Woo! Couldn't quite get through that one, but let's talk about all that, shall we? Starting off at the heads of these figures, Rebor have done a fairly good job capturing the likeness of T.rex in their sculpts, and the detail is far and away at its best on this area of the dinosaurs. The larger, more ornamental scales of Tyrannosaurus rex, particularly on the nasal ridge and snout, all look incredibly crisp. And I'm particularly impressed with how finite some of them are, particularly around the golden eyes there. You can see that this rex is sculpted in the standard open mouth roaring position. No articulation or anything on these grab and goes, but you have got some individually sculpted teeth which are painted in a grayish white coloration. And I'll give Rebor credit, the QC on the paint of these teeth is pretty top notch. I'm not seeing a single slop anywhere, which is impressive. I feel like I expected some issues on such a cheap figure, but nope, well done. The tongue is nicely textured, as are the cheeks, and you can see that the pink paint on the inside of the mouth is actually a lighter color in Roberta. And while we're looking at the mouths, I'd like to point out that these Rexes do indeed have binocular vision, which you would expect on a scientifically accurate model, quote unquote. Moving down the body, you can see that the style of the head and the rest of the body seem to be very different. The material is a lot more glossy, and the detail work is not nearly as crisp. Still, there's a lot to the sculpt here, with a ton of wrinkles forming across the flexing muscles and tendons in the neck. You can also see some subtle osteoderms that become more pronounced as you hit the midsection, where you get an indication of the shoulder blade and ribs beneath the folds of skin and cross-hatch leathery scales. It doesn't look like all of the details have been preserved from the original sculpt, but honestly, with how over-textured some of Rebor's works can be, that may be a blessing in disguise. I will say I absolutely love the skin details, the way it's pulling away from the body as the leg braces and bunching up around the thigh. That all looks great. The wrinkles continue all the way down the gently downward sloping tail, and you can see some larger scale work on the underbelly of the animal coming up onto the side of the tail there. Overall, for figures that run in that $20 range, I think the sculpt on these things is pretty impressive. I would probably be cheering for them more if the remaining 85% of the sculpts were as crisp as the head, but for what it is, I guess I'd be hard-pressed to complain. I think the feet of these figures look incredible, particularly on Rawhead. The large plate scales combined with the smaller reticula and that dark paint really gives the foot the look of an emu's, which I think is always cool to see. The nails are not painted separately, but the layers of colors used here are enough to make them look as convincing as the rest of the foot. Roberta's feet don't do as good of a job in selling the look, but the sculpt being the same as Rawhead's, they still look good. The legs are incredibly well muscled. I love how gracile the ankles look, and then just past those you can see the bulging calves as well as some fantastic movement that's been captured in the skin around the joints as you make your way up to those beefy thighs. Yeah, the muscle tones here are all handled beautifully. The arms are sculpted facing inwards and also seem to have their fair share of good muscles. I'm particularly fond of how the skin hangs down around the shoulder there. I think that's a nice sculptural area. The pectoral region is also quite well captured and looks nice and powerful. From a dorsal view, you can get a good look at more of that scale detail on the top of the head and how it transitions rather suddenly into the wrinkles and striations that run all the way down the back to the tip of the tail. Taking a look at the underbelly, you can see lovely muscles in the lower jaw as well as hanging skin in the throat. Once you hit the torso, this area of the sculpt has larger, more rectangular scales that seem to shrink in size the closer you get to the flanks, but the skin details beneath the scales, particularly once you hit the tail, look great. So yeah, the sculpt work on these Rexes is by and large quite good for such a cheap figure. Now, I really hate to do this, I really do, but since Rebor touted these as scientifically accurate figures, I feel like I need to address a few things. I'll start by saying that these are easily the most accurate T-Rex sculpts that Rebor have delivered, but that's not really saying much when you look at the competition. But there are some glaring issues, and I'm going to real quick lightning round them for anyone wondering if these could pass as scientific models for their collection. First off, on the head, you can see that Rebor being Rebor couldn't resist adding in some JP-style brows to give these Rexes some angry eyes. There's also still a decent amount of shrink wrapping on the face as well, most notably around the antorbital fenestra region. They're doesn't appear to be much in terms of extraoral tissue on the upper mandible, and the lower mandible seems to feature some fleshy, sagging Rottweiler lips. Since the presence or lack thereof of quote-unquote lips on dinosaurs is still up for debate, neither including them or omitting them would be more or less accurate, since nothing is set in stone. See what I did there? Fossils, they're set in... Alright, forget you then. I won't hold it against Rebor for not including them on their figures. That's really something that comes down to what the artist believes based on the available evidence at hand. Personally, I lean towards the idea of theropods possessing some form of extraoral tissue, but I still love me a grinning T.rex figure nonetheless. The backs of the toes have that lovely plate scaling, but to the best of my knowledge, they should really just be padded, or at least with less defined plate scales. The pubic boot should not be as apparent, and Rebor have done a decent job ensuring the Rexes are bulky enough from a side view to disguise it for the most part, but really, they should be even rounder, and the boot shouldn't even be seen at all given the presence of the gastralia. And speaking of the girth of this Rex, we come to this figure's largest problem from both a scientific and aesthetic standpoint. Look at these things from a dorsal view, particularly Roberta there. The rib cage is so painfully apparent on these figures, it looks like they both swallowed a fully inflated beach ball. Rawhead looks a little better, but Roberta needs a Triceratops burger stat. I don't think you need to be a paleontologist or even an artist to realize how awkward that looks. What's weird is these two look like they have some good girth from a side view, barring the shrink wrapping on the ribs and shoulder blades there, and even head on it doesn't seem that bad, but the second you flip them up, it's just skin and bones. And weirder still, Rawhead appears to actually fare better in this regard, like I said, but they're the same sculpt and mold. I don't know if it's a paint thing or a QC issue that makes Roberta look worse here, but it's still bad on both figures. So yeah, this is still a very shrink-wrapped Tyrannosaurus Rex with some noticeably cliche design choices that cripples its status as a quote-unquote scientific model. Perhaps things like the emaciated frame were done to cut back on materials, but still, it bears discussing. That being said, like all of Rebor's quote-unquote scientific models that have come before, it still has its charms, and it's a pretty cool Rex figure regardless. Honestly, I hate harping on accuracy, mostly because I have a very entry-level knowledge of these animals, but I do feel like it bears discussing when a model is branded as scientifically accurate. I also feel particularly bad harping on any aspect of these figures, given how technically well done they are for such an affordable price, but I'm a grouch, yo. Moving on, the poses are simple but classy. These Rexes are striding forward with their tail sweeping back and down behind them as they roar out to whatever it is they're looking at. It's reminiscent of the classic Carnegie King poses, but done in a less awkward, more graceful manner. I will say those support rods are required for mine. Roberta can't stand without it, and Rawhead can only stand on his own if his tail is hanging over the edge of the table. I've seen some collectors grab and go Rexes standing fine, and I imagine they're easy enough to fix, but I guess balance is just luck of the draw with these, so bear that in mind. Now let's talk about their paint jobs. The only real difference between these two figures, aside from the weird disparity in degree of chest shrink wrapping. Roberta is done in those classic JP colors with a dark brown dorsal coloration transitioning into a lighter brown coloration along the flanks and finally into a tan color along the underbelly. For being largely three dull colors, the application is still pretty well done and highlights the detail quite well, particularly on the face, where you've got some dry brushing that highlights all of that gorgeous scale work quite nicely. I also like the sort of banding effect on the tail, which makes for some good breakup. Rawhead is a bit more colorful with a red head that transitions into a mustard yellow body with grayish brown coloration that runs down from the back and onto the flanks while also shading the muscle tones. The underbelly is a cream coloration, and the feet are painted in a dark gray that's been applied over the cream color. Again, I think it's competently applied, and the work on the face really brings all of that detail to life, particularly the dry brushing of of the cream over the red on the lower mandible. That's gorgeous. Honestly, my biggest critique with these figures, sculpt elements aside, is that neither of these color schemes are original, and sadder still, neither are the upcoming paint jobs. Originally, I was thinking I was only going to get one of these sculpts, and the one that first caught my eye was Rawhead. I couldn't remember seeing another color scheme like that on a dinosaur figure until it was brought to my attention that Sideshow utilized these colors on one of their T-Rex statues. Then, of course, Roberta is just another JP-inspired color scheme that we've seen a million times before. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I am disappointed that Rebor didn't do something unique for at least one of these models. I can see why people are excited to finally have a Dinosaur Revolution-style Tyrannosaurus Rex, but did we really need more JP-inspired color schemes when there's an entire animal kingdom Rebor could have pulled inspiration from? Again, I can see doing maybe one in that style of JP so we could experience those classic colors on a more accurate figure, but still, I just feel like Rebor had a chance to make some unique takes on Tyrannosaurus Rex in an oversaturated market, but instead stuck to their methods of piggybacking off of other artists. Still, my disappointment in the familiarity doesn't detract from the successes of these paint jobs, and honestly, seeing them together, they actually appear to play off of each other wonderfully as a male and female pair. Something to be wary of is I've already noticed plenty areas of paint wear on these figures almost immediately after getting them out of the package, so I'm not sure how durable the color is on them. If you were planning to use them for toy photography or any sort of activity that could lead to paint wear, you may want to reconsider if you're concerned about keeping your figures mint. And that makes for a good segue into my next point, the quality. Obviously, when you're getting something that looks this good and is this big for this cheap, there's always the question of, but is the quality good? And I gotta say, these Rebor Rexes hold up fairly well in that regard. They're made of hollow vinyl instead of plastic, but the vinyl feels pretty sturdy. There are seams on the tail, legs, and around the head of the figures, but they're fairly well disguised by the sculpt, which is good to see. So for the price, I think the sculpts, paint, and quality are all well above passing in my eyes, at least from a technical standpoint. Now for the size of these figures, they both measure in at 17 inches long, or around 43 centimeters from tip of the tail to tip of the snout, and stand in at around 6¼ inches off the ground, or around 16 centimeters tall at the back of the neck. Rebor marketed these as being 1/35th scale, but if we take Scotty's length of 42 feet into consideration, that would actually put these figures in that 1/30th scale range. So a little on the larger side. If you're one of those strict collectors who only likes 1/35th scale range, then you're out of luck with these figures, unless we find one that's around 50 feet long or so someday. Yeah, dream on. Let's get into some size comparisons, always a favorite part of mine, and I have got a ton to go through, so get comfortable. First up, it's the accurate versus the Jurassic, the scientific versus the prolific. Here are the grab and goes facing off against Rebor's Killer Queens, both the jungle and plain variant, and you can see how those two figures size up to these grab and go Rexes. The G&Gs stand a good deal taller, but are pretty similar in terms of the length and not nearly as bulky. It's also pretty easy to see the quote-unquote influences Rebor have picked up from the JP-style Rexes, as well as the difference in finish between these two figures. I'm fairly certain that's a result of the material the G&Gs are cast in. Next up, we have the Rebor Vanilla Ice Tyrannosaurus Rex figures, and yes, I know these are meant to be Vistatosaurus Rex models, but they were called Tyrannosaurus Rex by Rebor, probably to avoid the wrath of Universal, so I'm counting them. Like the Killer Queens, Vanilla Ice is much more squat than these new offerings, and they feature a lot more crisp detail work across the board. And yeah, comparisons like these make it easy to understand the disparity in price and see the pros and cons of the different lines. Let's keep things rolling with more T-Rex comparisons. First up, we have the recently reviewed Nanmu Tyrannosaurus Rex Alpha, and that gorgeous model stands a bit further off the ground than Rebor's offering. And yeah, like I said, I guess it is kind of fun to see Rexy's aesthetics on a more scientifically accurate figure, so there you go, I guess. And let's bring in the Collecta duo, and you can see that these figures are pretty similar in terms of their heights. Aesthetically speaking, they couldn't be at further ends of the spectrum, but in regards to size alone, they're not too far apart. Alright, now we've got the Safari/Carnegie gang, and whereas their fluffy 2017 offering is a gorgeous figure, we know it's a little dated by our current understandings. The Carnegie figure, however, holds up incredibly well for its age, and is actually more accurate when you compare it to these new figures from Rebor. So I guess if accuracy is your big thing, I would recommend trying to get that old Carnegie Rex before going after these Rebor figures. It's much closer to the mark despite its age and some underwhelming characteristics. But if you want to talk about figures that have held up well over the years, here it is with the Batat Tyrannosaurus Rex. Aged like a fine wine, still one of the best figures when it comes to portraying an accurate Rex. People like to give Safari and Collecta a lot of credit for accuracy, but I think a lot of them forget this king. And even though it's a lot smaller than these Rebor Rexes, I think you know what I'm gonna say here. You can't beat the classics. And then we have the 2020 Rebor Rexes with the 2020 PNSO Tyrannosaurus Rex Wilson, and I just love that figure, I really do. If you were to ask me which one I prefer between these two molds, I would probably recommend Wilson. It's only about $10 more, and for that money, you're getting a nice, solid figure with an articulated jaw to boot. Neither of them are 100% accurate, but Wilson at least is higher on the quality ladder, and thus more bang for your buck. But then again, you know, you spend an extra $10 more than what Wilson goes for, and you can get both of these Rebor Rexes. So, you know, take your pick. And for the final Rex, here it is with the gold standard comparison, the Papo Squatting Tyrannosaurus Rex. And you can see that that model stands ever so slightly taller than these Rebor grab-and-go Rexes. Hopefully there was at least one mold out of all of those Rexes that would give you an idea of the size you can expect from these Rebor figures. But we're not stopping there. Oh, no, we gotta bring in some more Rebor comparisons for you. First up, we have their ugly brood of a Carnotaurus for a size comparison. This was among another of Rebor's more scientific models, so this is an appropriate comparison to make. The size doesn't feel too terribly off between these two, I must say, especially if you were to look at this from a Fallen Kingdom perspective, so that's kind of cool for you Jurassic fans out there. Next up, we have the grab-and-goes with last year's Stegosaurus Garden, the jungle variant, one of the few living herbivores that Rebor have done. I wish I had a living Triceratops to compare these to, cough cough, but I suppose a Stegosaurus will have to do. I have reviewed a lot of these figures on the channel, by the way. Links will be in the description if you're curious to see more of them. And as always, if you're doing a T-Rex review, you gotta bring in some Spinosaurus figures. So first up, let's bring in yesterday's PNSO Spinosaurus figure, Essien 2.0, and as you can see, these Rebor Rexes absolutely tower over that little figure, but in size only, I must say. I think Essien manages to cram a lot more appealing detail and paint into the sculpt, but for about $20 more than the grab-and-go Rexes, I guess it certainly had better, hadn't it? And for a final size comparison, here are the grab-and-go Rexes against the big beaut of a Nanmu Spinosaurus figure. You know, from a JP Universe standpoint, I actually think these two size up pretty well next to each other, I gotta say. So there you have it, guys and gals. That is going to do it for my review of the grab-and-go Tyrannosaurus Rex from Rebor, both the A and B versions. I certainly hope it was long enough for you. So final thoughts on these two figures. Are they accurate? No, not really. But are they still pretty awesome Rex figures, especially when you consider how big and dirt cheap they are? Absolutely. I mean, for right around $20 a pop, you are getting some highly detailed and nicely colored figures. Now, if you were to ask me which one of them I prefer, it's a tough choice. Like I said, I was drawn to the colors of Rawhead right out of the gate. But seeing them in together, I think they both have some good things going for them. If you had to pick just one, I would say go for the B version because, you know, like I said, the issue with the midsection isn't as noticeable on it, and at least it's a color scheme that you haven't seen as many times. Now, that being said, if you're after a 100% accurate figure, then you'll need to keep looking, and probably will for some time. But if you're in the market for some decent Rexes that aren't JP but still feature some stylized flair, then these are certainly the ones to go for, especially if price is a question. I certainly dig them, and am very excited for the next two editions, the upcoming Spinosaurus of the grab-and-go line, and whatever else Rebor may or may not end up doing down the road. Now, if you're not 100% sold on these figures after this review, review, I'll close with saying that supporting this line and a more scientific approach from Rebor may be worthwhile in the long run. Like I said before, it's an affordable and bang for your buck figure, and buying it shows Rebor that we as consumers are interested in more than just another pop culture inspired model. As a result, we might see Rebor returning to their glory days of dinosaur sculpting while implementing some of the improved techniques they developed over the years. If buying these great figures means that we'll start seeing stuff like their old Ceratosaurus or Acrocanthosaurus with upgrades, then I am 100% in. But as always, I want to know what you guys think of these figures. Do you own them yet? Are you planning to pick them up? Which variant is your favorite and why? Drop a comment down below with all of your thoughts. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of Killershrewfan's 12 Days of Reviews. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again tomorrow when I'm going to be taking a look at an absolutely legendary figure. Until then, take care out there, and bye-bye.